The engine of my old sedan hummed quietly as I pulled into the parking lot of the diner. It had been one of those mornings, long, tiring, and utterly uneventful. The kind where the coffee just wasn't strong enough, and every red light felt like an eternity. I didn't expect anything different today. I was just hoping for a solid meal and a moment of peace. That was until I saw the flashing lights in my rearview mirror. It was the kind of moment you read about in a crime novel, but somehow, this felt more absurd than dramatic. I wasn't being pulled over by a regular cop. No, that would have made too much sense. Instead, I was being stopped by a car with the strangest logo, HOA enforcement. And as if that wasn't bizarre enough, the officer stepping out of the car had the attitude of someone who thought they were the law itself. Meet Karen, the HOA cop, who had somehow managed to claim authority over more than just property lines. I hit the brake, rolling to a stop right in front of the diner. The flickering neon sign buzzed above, oblivious to the strange situation unfolding below. Karen sauntered toward my car like she owned the entire block. I half expected her to issue a ticket for breathing too loudly. The moment she reached my window, I couldn't help but notice her overly crisp uniform and the way her face twisted into a permanent sneer. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" she asked, her voice cool, like she was performing a routine inspection rather than, pulling over someone just trying to eat their lunch. I looked past her at the diner. Inside, a few familiar sheriff's department vehicles were parked, and through the window, I could see several officers seated around the table, eating their meals, gossiping like it was just another Tuesday. "Honestly, I have no idea," I said, hoping she'd just tell me to move along, and I could pretend this never happened. But no, Karen wasn't having any of that. She stepped closer to my window, her eyes narrowing with every word she spoke. "You were parked too close to a fire hydrant," she said, as if it were the most egregious crime known to man. I raised an eyebrow. "Really? In front of a diner full of sheriffs?" I nodded toward the window. "Are you sure they want to see you writing me up for something that ridiculous?" Karen didn't even flinch. "I'm the authority here," she said, tapping the side of her vehicle with a proud thud. "I don't need to explain myself to anyone." The irony of it all hit me. A woman with a badge that looked like it was bought on some sketchy online store was issuing a citation in front of an entire sheriff's department, most of whom were probably stuffed with pancakes and coffee at that very moment. There was something terribly wrong with the picture, and the more I thought about it, the more the entire scene seemed like a joke I wasn't in on. I wasn't sure what made me do it, but before I could stop myself, I threw the car in park, threw open the door, and stepped out onto the pavement. I don't think the sheriff's department would appreciate this," I said, keeping my voice light, but there was a layer of challenge underneath it. I wasn't trying to start a fight. Well, not exactly, but something about Karen's self-assuredness rubbed me the wrong way. She looked at me, unimpressed. "And I don't appreciate people questioning my authority," she said, barely concealing a smirk. "You should have thought about that before parking in front of a hydrant." I let out a half-laugh, more from disbelief than humor. "A hydrant? Seriously? What next? You going to fine me for not mowing my lawn?" Karen's eyes twitched, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of something, maybe guilt, maybe frustration, before her stoic expression returned. But instead of backing down, I pushed forward. "Karen," I said, using her name almost sarcastically, "don't you think it's a little odd? The whole sheriff's department is inside the diner eating, while you're out here playing parking ticket enforcer. Does that not seem a little out of place to you?" Her gaze followed mine toward the diner. It was a subtle shift, but I noticed the way her posture tensed when she realized the eyes of the law were on her. The sheriff's vehicles, the officers talking inside, all suddenly became a problem she didn't want to acknowledge. She quickly turned back to me, her voice steady, but there was a flicker of hesitation now. "I'm handling this situation. You can either stay here, or I can have you towed. Your choice." I didn't respond right away. The whole thing felt more and more like a bad sitcom, and I couldn't decide if I was the punchline or the straight man. But in that moment, As I glanced at the officers inside the diner who were still happily munching away on their lunches, something told me this wasn't just about a fire hydrant or a bogus parking ticket. There was more going on here, and I needed to find out what. Turning back to Karen, I gave her a smile. You know, maybe we should take this inside. I'd love to hear what the sheriff's department thinks of your methods. The reaction was almost comical. Karen's face twisted with annoyance, but I didn't care. I took a step toward the diner, fully aware of the awkward situation I was walking into. The sheriff's department was right there, and if Karen thought she was above being questioned, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. For a moment, she just stood there, a combination of frustration and disbelief crossing her face. But when I pushed open the diner's door, the tension in the air grew thick. It wasn't just about the citation anymore, it was about something bigger. Something more sinister. And as I walked into that diner, I knew one thing for sure: whatever was going on, I was about to uncover it. I glanced back one last time at Karen, standing outside with that ridiculous smirk still plastered on her face, and I couldn't help but think that this had to be the strangest Tuesday of my life. Little did I know, it was only the beginning. I pushed open the diner door, and a wave of warmth hit me, carrying the scent of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee. It was a small, no-frills kind of place, the kind of spot you visit when you just want to eat and leave without any fuss. The kind of spot where everyone knows everyone else, and the only drama is whether or not the eggs are cooked right. But as I stepped inside, all of that small-town charm suddenly felt like a facade. Behind the counter, a tired waitress was scribbling down an order while a few officers from the sheriff's department sat in a booth by the window, exchanging stories and laughing like this was just another lazy afternoon. They barely glanced up when I entered. They didn't need to. They were too comfortable in their little world, too used to the quiet existence where nothing ever really changed. But for me, this was a moment of reckoning, and I was determined to make it count. I walked past the booth of sheriffs, trying to look casual, though I couldn't hide the slight edge in my movements. I wasn't here to sit down for lunch. I was here to find out what the hell was going on. Karen might have thought she could intimidate me with her fake authority, but something about the whole situation stunk. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Why was she pulling people over for things that didn't matter while the actual cops sat inside, ignoring it all? It was as if there was a tacit agreement that no one was supposed to rock the boat. Well, I was about to do just that. I took a seat at the counter, and the waitress gave me a polite but distracted smile, like she was just going through the motions. She poured me a cup of coffee without asking and then walked away. I wasn't sure if she was trying to avoid my gaze on purpose or if she was just too tired to care. Either way, it didn't matter. My focus was on the group of sheriffs still at the booth, and I knew this was my chance to get some answers. One of the sheriffs, a big guy with a thick mustache and a too-tight uniform, was telling some story about a high-speed chase involving a stolen lawnmower. The table erupted in laughter, but I wasn't in the mood for jokes. I needed to know if they had any idea what was happening outside. So I stood up, adjusting my jacket like I was about to make a move. Without thinking, I walked over to their table, casually leaning against the wall, just close enough to catch their attention. "Hey," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "So, about that HOA officer outside, what's her deal? Does she have some kind of special badge that lets her stop cars in front of the diner?" The laughter died almost instantly. The sheriff with the mustache looked up at me, his expression shifting from amusement to something more guarded. "What's that now?" he asked, his tone a little too smooth, like he was trying to keep the conversation from escalating. "Karen," I said casually as if I were talking about a neighbor. "The one who just pulled me over outside. I mean, she's not even a real cop, right? Is there some sort of special rule that lets her pull people over like that?" There was a long pause. One of the other sheriffs, a younger guy with short hair and a sharp jaw, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I could see his eyes darting between me and the rest of the table, like he was trying to figure out whether he should say something or stay quiet. The big sheriff with the mustache cleared his throat, and I could see him trying to figure out how to handle the situation. Look, man, I don't know what you think you saw, but Karen's not someone you want to mess with, he said, his voice a little too tight. She's got her role to play, and we've got ours. Just leave it alone. I stared at him for a second, letting the words sink in. Leave it alone? You're telling me that you know she's out there, pulling people over for parking too close to a hydrant, and you're just gonna pretend like it's no big deal? The younger sheriff, who'd been quiet up until this point, finally spoke up. It's not like that, he muttered, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. She's just doing her job. Sometimes she gets a little carried away, but it's not like anyone's been hurt, right? I felt a surge of frustration, but I kept it in check. She's harassing people. She's not a cop. She's a parking cop with delusions of grandeur, and you guys are letting her run wild. I let the words hang in the air between us, hoping they'd sink in. The big sheriff with the mustache scowled, clearly not happy with the direction this conversation was taking. Look, he said in a low, controlled voice. You don't know what you're talking about. This is none of your business. We don't need to explain ourselves to some guy who thinks he knows everything. At that, something inside me snapped. I wasn't just going to let this go. Not after everything I'd seen. None of my business? I repeated louder this time. This is my business. She's out there bullying people and playing cop while you guys are inside eating sandwiches like it's all fine and dandy. You think this is normal? The room went still. The other officers at the table exchanged looks, their once casual demeanor now replaced with uncertainty. It was like they all realized that something wasn't right, but none of them wanted to be the one to step up and say it. The big sheriff with the mustache stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You need to watch your tone, he growled, his voice menacing. We don't take kindly to people making trouble. I stood my ground, my heart pounding in my chest. Maybe I don't care about your rules. Maybe I care more about people being treated like human beings instead of traffic violations. So tell me, Sheriff, what's going on here? There was a moment of silence, a heavy weight hanging in the air. And then, as if on cue, Karen appeared in the doorway. She stood there, arms crossed, a smug look on her face like she'd been watching the whole thing unfold. Well, she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. Looks like we've got a bit of a situation here, don't we? I turned to face her, my anger flaring. You're damn right we do. The sheriffs, sensing that this was quickly getting out of hand, began to shift uncomfortably. No one said anything, but I could see the cracks in their armor. They didn't want to deal with this. They didn't want to confront Karen or her overstep of authority. And that was when I realized something. This wasn't just about a parking ticket. It wasn't just about Karen's absurd power trip. It was about a town full of people too comfortable with letting things slide, too used to ignoring the small abuses of power. But today, that was all going to change. I took a deep breath, ready for whatever came next. It was time to make them face the truth, whether they liked it or not. I wasn't sure what I expected when I walked into that diner, but it certainly wasn't the tense atmosphere that filled the air now. Karen's sudden appearance had added another layer of complication to the situation, and it was clear that no one, least of all the sheriffs, was comfortable with how things were unfolding. They didn't know how to handle someone like me. Someone who wasn't just going to back down. And it wasn't just me anymore. It was everyone in this little town who had been quietly letting Karen run roughshod over them. The tension was palpable, and I could feel my pulse quicken as I stood there facing Karen. The sheriffs at the table were doing their best to avoid eye contact, pretending like they weren't complicit in this charade. But I knew better. They were just as much a part of the problem as Karen was. The longer I stood there, the more it became clear that this wasn't some isolated incident. This was part of something much larger, a network of power that was being abused under everyone's noses. Karen gave me a cold smile, her arms still crossed as she took a step forward. You've got a real mouth on you, don't you? She said, her voice dripping with condescension. It was the same tone she'd used when she first pulled me over, the kind of tone that made it clear she was used to getting what she wanted without any pushback. I didn't flinch. I'm just trying to understand why you think you have the right to stop people on the street and issue fines like you're some kind of cop. What's your deal, Karen? What are you really doing here?" Her smile faltered for a second, and I could see the tension in her shoulders as she tried to maintain control of the situation. But it wasn't working. The way she was acting, so defensive and aggressive, made me think she wasn't used to being questioned, at least not by someone like me. I was pretty sure the sheriffs knew what she was doing but hadn't had the guts to say anything, maybe because they were scared of the fallout. Or maybe they just didn't care enough to rock the boat. The big sheriff with the mustache, who had been mostly silent up until now, cleared his throat. "That's enough," he said, his voice gruff, but I could tell there was a hint of nervousness there. "Karen's just doing her job. You don't need to make a scene." "A scene?" I repeated, incredulous. "You want to talk about making a scene? You guys have been letting this woman pull people over for months, and now you want me to keep quiet? About what exactly? A bogus ticket?" The sheriff shot me a hard look, but I could see the cracks forming. He was starting to realize that the more he tried to shut me down, the more people were paying attention. And the more people who paid attention, the more the truth would come out. I wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when I could feel that the balance of power in this town was shifting, even if it was just a little bit. Karen took another step forward, her eyes narrowing. "You don't know anything about me or what I do. So maybe it's time you just leave this alone, huh?" That's when I saw it. A small detail that I hadn't noticed before. As Karen stood there, holding her ground, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, something I hadn't expected. It wasn't just confidence or smugness. It was fear. For the first time, Karen seemed genuinely rattled. She wasn't just trying to intimidate me. She was trying to cover something up. Something big. I leaned in a little closer, my voice low but firm. "You can't just keep pushing people around, Karen. You're not a cop. And you're certainly not above the law. So what is it? What's really going on here?" She flinched, just barely. But it was enough. I'd hit a nerve. The sheriff with the mustache saw it too, and his eyes flicked between Karen and me like he was trying to decide whether to step in or let this play out. I could see the internal struggle on his face. He knew I was right. He knew that Karen had crossed the line, but he didn't know how to fix it without facing the consequences himself. For a moment, the room fell silent. The waitress, who had been quietly refilling coffee cups in the background, stopped what she was doing and stood still, watching us with wide eyes. The other officers at the table were suddenly very interested in their menus, pretending to read but not really doing so. I could almost hear the gears turning in their heads as they tried to figure out what to do next. And then, the youngest sheriff, the one with the sharp jaw and the uneasy expression, spoke up. His voice was quiet but clear. "You're right," he said, looking directly at Karen. "You're not a cop. And what you're doing out there, it's not right." Karen whipped her head toward him, her face going red. "What are you talking about?" she snapped, but there was no real conviction in her voice now. It was like she could feel the walls closing in on her, and all the bravado she'd been holding onto was starting to crumble. "I'm saying," the young sheriff continued, his voice gaining strength, "that you've been pulling people over for no reason. You've been giving out tickets for things that don't matter. And we've all been letting it happen." He paused, his gaze shifting toward the rest of the sheriffs. "We all knew it was wrong, but we didn't say anything. But it's time we do something about it." I felt a rush of adrenaline. This was it. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment when the truth finally came to light. It wasn't just me anymore. It wasn't just about one parking ticket or one overzealous HOA cop. This was about the entire town standing up against the abuse of power, about people finally refusing to let this kind of thing slide. Karen's face twisted in anger, but she didn't say anything more. She just stood there, fists clenched at her sides, seething. She could feel the walls closing in. There was nowhere for her to go now. The young sheriff had spoken the truth, and everyone in that diner knew it. The big sheriff with the mustache let out a long sigh, and for the first time, he didn't look so sure of himself. "Karen," he said, his voice tired. "You've gone too far this time. We can't keep turning a blind eye to this. You need to step down." It was like the air in the room had been sucked out in one big whoosh. Karen opened her mouth as if to protest, but no sound came out. The weight of what was happening seemed to settle over her like a heavy fog. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. It wasn't over yet, but this was a start. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. And as I looked around the diner, I could see the change in the eyes of the officers. They weren't just spectators anymore. They were part of something bigger, something that was going to shake things up in this small town. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was on the right side of history. The silence in the diner was deafening, a strange stillness hanging in the air after everything had been said. Karen stood there, frozen, staring down at the sheriff who had finally spoken out against her. The big sheriff with the mustache hadn't said much, but there was something in his voice that suggested he knew this was going to be the end for her. The tension between the officers was palpable, the weight of what was happening settling in. For the first time, Karen wasn't the one in control of the situation. She wasn't the one issuing orders or playing the tough enforcer. Now, she was the one caught in the web she'd spun. I could see the realization in her eyes that this wasn't going to blow over the way she had hoped. She wasn't going to walk out of here with a slap on the wrist or another pointless ticket to hand out. This was real. The young sheriff, the one who had spoken out, glanced at me as if to make sure I was still there, still watching. His eyes were filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty, as if he, too, couldn't quite believe that this moment was actually happening. I wasn't sure what to do next, but one thing was certain: this wasn't going to be over quickly. The small victory I had been hoping for was only the beginning, and now that the truth was out, the real consequences were starting to surface. Karen took a long, slow breath, her chest rising and falling with each inhalation. She took a step back, almost like she was trying to distance herself from the situation, but it was too late. The damage was done. The other officers at the table, who had been silent spectators until now, were no longer pretending that everything was fine. They weren't all heroes, but they were beginning to see the cracks in the system they had once been comfortable with. The young sheriff continued to stand firm, his stance unwavering as he turned toward the big sheriff with the mustache. "She's done," he said, his voice clear and resolute. "This isn't something we can let slide anymore. We've all seen it for months. This has been going on under our noses, and it's time to stop it." The big sheriff hesitated for a moment, his brow furrowing as he took in the words. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, and for the first time, I could see the weight of his position pressing down on him. He'd been one of the ones to turn a blind eye, to let things slide because it was easier to do nothing than to stand up and do the right thing. But now, with the young sheriff speaking out, there was no more room for complacency. There was no excuse left. "I'll handle it," the big sheriff finally said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Karen, you need to come with me." Karen's expression flickered briefly, a flash of defiance crossing her face before it was quickly replaced with something softer. Fear, maybe? Or just the weight of her own realization that her actions had caught up with her. She looked over at the rest of the officers, her eyes pleading, but no one met her gaze. They had made their choice, and now it was her turn to face the consequences of her actions. As she followed the big sheriff out of the diner, there was an odd sense of finality in the air. The officers who had been complicit in Karen's behavior were still sitting at the table, their unease now apparent. They didn't know what to say, what to do, but for the first time, they were forced to acknowledge the fact that things couldn't continue the way they had been. The system, as it had operated for so long, was broken. And they were part of the problem. I stood there for a few moments, the weight of everything that had just happened sinking in. My mind was racing, trying to process everything. I had come into this diner just looking for some answers, hoping to clear up a weird situation with an overzealous HOA cop. I hadn't expected to walk out with the entire sheriff's department under scrutiny. But that was the thing about truth, it doesn't stay buried forever. It has a way of coming to light, no matter how hard people try to keep it hidden. As I turned to leave the diner, I caught sight of the waitress, who had been quietly watching everything unfold from behind the counter. She had been so focused on her work that I hadn't given her much thought, but now, as our eyes met, I could see a flicker of something in her gaze. Hope, maybe? Or maybe just a sense of relief. She had seen it too, just like the rest of us. Karen had been abusing her position, and now that it was out in the open, there was a sense of justice in the air. The world wasn't perfect, but at least for one small moment, it felt like things were starting to shift. As I stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, I felt the weight of the day pressing down on me. My fight wasn't over yet. Karen might have been taken down, but the consequences of what had happened still loomed large. The sheriff's department had some serious questions to answer, and the town was going to have to reckon with the way things had been run for so long. I wasn't the hero here. I hadn't single-handedly taken down a corrupt system, but I had helped expose it. And sometimes that's all it takes, just one person who's willing to ask the right questions and refuse to let the small injustices go unnoticed. I walked down the street, my footsteps echoing in the quiet town, when something caught my eye. It was a car parked by the side of the road, an old sedan with a faint HOA enforcement sticker on the side. The same kind of car Karen had been driving earlier. My heart skipped a beat. I had hoped that this would be the end of it. That once Karen was dealt with, things would return to normal. But as I looked at the car, something told me that the problems weren't just going to disappear. There were more people like Karen out there, more people who thought they could abuse their power without consequences. I shook my head, a wry smile pulling at the corner of my lips. I had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time I'd have to deal with situations like this. But for now, I had won. For now, I had stood up for what was right, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like I had made a real difference. The future was uncertain, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that I had spoken up. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to make a real change. As I walked away from the diner, I couldn't help but think that this wasn't just about a bad HOA cop. This was about taking a stand. About refusing to let things slide just because they always had. It was about making sure that the truth couldn't be ignored, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. And in that moment, I realized something important. The fight wasn't over, but I was ready for whatever came next. Because in the end, one voice, one person who refuses to stay quiet, can make all the difference.